Welcome to the first in a series of 5 Rehabilitation Services Administration Technical Assistance Programs on prior approval. My name is Terry Martin, Technical Assistance Specialist in the Rehabilitation Services Administration State Monitoring and Improvement Division's Technical Assistance Unit. The presenter for this program is David Steele, Chief of RSA's State Monitoring and Improvement Division's Fiscal Unit, and also joining David this afternoon is Julia Doyle, Fiscal Unit Financial Management Specialist. This technical assistance program will provide an overview of prior approval and basic information about guidance, grantee responsibilities, and the submission process. David?
Thanks, Terry. As Terry mentioned, this is the first webinar in a series of 5 related to prior written approval for certain grant activities and expenditures in accordance with the Uniform Guidance. This webinar is applicable to all of the Rehabilitation Service Administration's Formula Grant Awards and includes the following topics: the purpose of the Uniform Guidance, what prior approval is and is not, what to include in prior approval requests, how to submit requests, and finally, internal controls for prior approval. We received several comments from the field related to why prior approval, why is it an issue now? And to provide some background in relation to that, on December 26, 2014, the Department adopted the Office of Management and Budget's, OMB's Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for federal awards, also known as the Uniform Guidance. The Uniform Guidance is codified in CFR Part 200 and is applicable to all federal agencies. Once adopted, the Uniform Guidance superseded the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, also known as EDGAR, Part 74 and 80, as well as the flexibilities provided by an OSTR's 1995 Federal Register Notice. For RSA's Formula Grant Awards, the Uniform Guidance requirements became effective with the Federal Fiscal Year 2016 Grant Awards that began October 1st, 2015. It is important to note that RSA did not rescind the flexibilities provided by the OSTR's 1995 Federal Register Notice. The Federal Register Notice was superseded by the Uniform Guidance that provided overarching new federal regulations applicable to all federal agencies. The Uniform Guidance requirements support a government-wide focus on reducing and eliminating improper payments under federal awards. Improper payments include the use of grant funds for unallowable costs. The purpose of the Uniform Guidance was to streamline and combine the 8 OMB circulars that contain Federal Grant Administration regulations. By combining the OMB circulars into the Uniform Guidance, federal agencies and grantees no longer had to reference multiple OMB circulars to determine the applicable requirements. Additionally, the Uniform Guidance provided consistency for grantees that receive multiple grant awards from different federal agencies. There is one set of regulations applicable across federal programs. The areas requiring prior approval were those identified as being the most susceptible government-wide to waste, fraud, and abuse. It's important to remember that the Uniform Guidance is much more than just prior approval. It includes administrative, financial, and audit requirements, as well as cost principles for all federal grantees. RSA's implementation of the Uniform Guidance is consistent with the Department's processes for implementing the requirements across multiple grant award programs. And again, it's important to note that this is not just about RSA implementing prior approval or for the VR program's prior approval requirements. This is about the Uniform Guidance, which applies to multiple federal agencies as well as grant award programs, and ensuring that the implementation, RSA's implementation of prior approval is consistent with that in the department. The Department of Education's training and guidance regarding the Uniform Guidance can be found by visiting the department's website at ed.gov and searching for the term Uniform Guidance. So what is prior approval? Prior written approval, which will be referred to as prior approval from this point on in the presentation, is written approval from an official of the department who is authorized to grant such approval to assign a proposed expenditure to a federal program. Prior approvals mentioned in 25 sections of Uniform Guidance. Not all of those prior approval requirements are applicable to RSA's formula awards. With this webinar, we're posting a document that contains the specific citations where applicable to the VR awards in relationship to prior approval. It's our hope that shortly we'll be able to post those for our RSA's other grant awards as well. While the absence of prior approval does not in itself affect the reasonableness or allocability of costs, unless prior approval is specifically required for allowability, noncompliance with the requirement may result in enforcement actions and audit findings. Agencies need to be aware of the specific nature of prior approval requirements. For example, the purchase of general purpose equipment is subject to a capitalization threshold that has to be determined. So there's a certain amount of money above which equipment would be determined, an item would be determined to be classified as equipment. In other instances, such as participant support costs, there is no cost threshold. So if the activity is described as participant support cost, then it would need prior approval. So it's important to remember that not all prior approval is based on a cost threshold, and grantees need to be careful of the specific criteria that's listed in the regulation by the prior approval requirement. Prior approval is requested in advance of the activity, obligation, or expenditure. It's requested in writing. RSA won't be granting prior approval by telephone for last-minute requests. It's something that has to be submitted in writing, for which RSA will respond to in writing. It's specific to a grant award. For example, if it was for this grant award year, you would use the grant award number that's associated with the award for this federal fiscal year. It's required regardless of the cost of the expenditure, except for equipment. And as I mentioned in the example in the last slide, for participant support costs, there is no minimum threshold amount. If it meets the activities described as participant support cost, or it's classified as a participant support cost, then it's required to receive prior approval regardless of the amount of funds that's being expended for that. It's required whether for federal, non-federal program income funds used for grant purposes. So if it's being provided under the unified or combined VR section of the state plan, then it's going to require prior approval if it meets one of the conditions for which prior approval was required in the uniform guidance. Prior approval is not a mechanism to circumvent the agency's indirect cost rate or cost allocation plan. In many instances, in prior approval is being requested so that a cost or a charge can be charged directly to a federal award. If that cost is already identified in an indirect cost plan as being an indirect cost, then it's important. What we would first look for is that the agency would treat the cost as the indirect cost. This isn't a mechanism by which agencies can circumvent their indirect cost requirements and say, if it's already an approved indirect cost rate, we understand that. However, we would like to charge it directly instead, just to the VR award. That's not the intent of prior approval. It doesn't grant states an exemption from the agency's policies or procedures. If an agency has specific policies that require it to purchase equipment in a certain manner or at a certain cost underneath the state's policies or procedures, the state has to follow those. Just because they're getting prior approval to charge it to a federal award doesn't exempt them from the state processes or requirements. It's not agreement from RSA that the costs are allowable or allocable, or a manner to circumvent the possible recovery of funds or additional enforcement actions. If we granted prior approval for a certain cost or equipment amount and later find out that equipment wasn't necessary under an IPE or for a consumer service or was otherwise unallowable, the fact that it had prior approval doesn't circumvent the possible recovery of funds in such instances. The grantee remains responsible for several things. With any prior approval, grantees remain responsible for ensuring that all expenditures are allowable and allocable to the program in accordance with the uniform guidance and federal program requirements. Additionally, grantees are required to maintain written procedures for determining the allowability of costs in accordance with Subpart E, cost principles. including for prior approval, as well as maintaining internal controls, which we'll talk a little more about shortly.
Thank you, David, for that overview. Maybe it'd be helpful now to turn to what to include in prior approval requests and submitting the prior approval request.
Thanks, Terry. Certainly one of the questions we've gotten the most of is what do we include in prior approval requests when they're submitted? And so some of the things we look for or we need grantees to make sure that are included in requests include the grantee contact information, which should include the name of the agency submitting the request and the contact person and how we get in touch with that contact person in case RSA needs additional information or has additional questions. The amount of the cost to be incurred with supporting documentation. For example, the provider or contract estimate if they were, if we were talking about an establishment project or if we were talking about a repair. The reason for the prior approval request, including a uniform guidance citation under which the prior approval is being requested. This allows us to line up our approval process with what the agency is actually requesting to make sure that we're granting prior approval under the right circumstances and for the right reasons and responding to the grantee. The grant award number to which the expenditures will be charged. Please only include a single grant award number per request. If you plan to divide the costs across multiple awards, the cost must be applicable to the period of performance for each award, and prior approval must be granted to the cost to be charged to each award. With regard to if the grantee meets the carryover requirements to extend the period of the award for an additional year, that's still the same grant award number. So if they paid for that cost, if it was approved for that grant award, they could pay for it then out of the funds during the initial year of the appropriation or in the carryover period because it comes from the same grant award. However, if they then wanted to assign it to or split the cost with an additional federal grant award for the subsequent year, they would need prior approval for that separately. Also include information regarding whether other programs or grant will benefit from the expenditure. Here we'll be looking at are the costs being charged directly just the proportion allocable to the RSA grant program, and are they being allocated if those will benefit more than one grant program? And provide an assurance that the agency is following the state and federal purchasing requirements. For example, obtaining bids is required by state procurement procedures. When submitting prior approval requests, please submit them by email to your state's assigned financial management specialist. RSA will contact the requester if additional information or documentation is required to process the request. However, I like to say that the time it takes us to respond to a prior approval request is directly proportionate to the time or to the amount of information that we receive in the request. And so if you have doubts and submit additional information, it's generally better than to not submit enough and then have to get back in contact with you and then you submit them back to us in the back and forth process, which can take up time. So, it's better to submit more information to us that we can go through. It might not be necessary than to not submit sufficient information. Grantees should submit requests in a timely manner that provides RSA sufficient time to review them, correspond with the agencies to get clarification, and make a determination before the activity, obligation, or expenditure occurs. For individual requests, we would like to request 3 to 4 weeks is recommended. Requests for approval of capital expenditures, construction, and establishment projects may take longer to review depending on the complexity of the project. So if we're looking at construction or establishment projects and the conditions that are required to meet the regulations in those instances, it's likely that it's going to take us additional time to review those requests and provide the prior approval, so please plan accordingly. With regard to prior approval, it's important to note that RSA has in our recent on-site monitoring noted internal controls deficiencies with regard to a number of areas with states, and one of those areas relates to prior approval. And we've had several people asking, so what are we looking for with regard to internal controls, not just for prior approval, but in general? And so I wanted to give you a couple slides here that will introduce internal controls, which are part of the uniform guidance, and then talk more specifically about our expectations in relationship to prior approval. Internal controls means a process implemented by a non-federal entity designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives in the following categories: effectiveness and efficiency of operations, reliability of reporting for internal and external use, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. The uniform guidance places an emphasis on written internal control processes. And as noted in an earlier slide, there was a reference to the need to have a written process for how states determine the allowability of costs that are charged to the federal award. So internal controls under 2 CFR 200-303 states that the non-federal entity must establish and maintain effective internal control over federal awards that provides reasonable assurance that the non-federal entity is managing the federal award in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions of the awards. Comply with federal statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions of the awards. Evaluate and monitor compliance. Take prompt action when instances of non-compliance are identified. And take reasonable measures to safeguard personally identifiable information and other sensitive information. Each grantee must have internal controls to ensure that their processes they have written processes to ensure they are complying with the federal statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions of the award. And prior approval is one of those conditions of the award, that agencies obtain prior approval when required, prior to incurring costs or before undertaking certain activities that are listed in the uniform guidance. So what are we looking for with internal controls for prior approval? We're looking for grantees to have written processes that ensure identification of conditions that require prior approval. With regard to equipment purchases, we would look, do they have procedures in place or written policies for how they identify equipment that exceeds the threshold in the state, the capitalization threshold? And if so, what is the process for that, and how do they ensure that once it reaches that level that prior approval has been obtained? Submission of prior approval requests in a timely manner. Do they have a process to ensure that when prior approval is required for any of the areas under the program, that there's a process that they can request that in a timely manner before incurring the cost or undertaking the activity for which prior approval is needed? Monitoring a prior approval process to ensure internal controls result in prior approval being obtained. So are they monitoring to ensure, for example, with equipment that there is an equipment that's exceeding this threshold that's actually being purchased that did not have prior approval? How are they ensuring their processes ensure, and do they monitor for compliance with this requirement? And then in the event that they identify that noncompliance isn't being obtained, what steps are they taking to ensure, will they take to ensure that compliance is brought back in line, that whenever they've identified areas where prior approval was required but wasn't obtained, then what steps are they taking directly to ensure that their internal controls are revised so that they're catching those in previous instances so it doesn't happen again?
And David, is this written processes?
Yes, we are looking for written processes. With regard to ensuring compliance with federal awards, we oftentimes go out and states will tell us many wonderful things that they do verbally, and then we'll ask them to demonstrate those in writing only to find out that the processes aren't written down and that there's no real form or structure to them. So what we're looking for are the states, in many instances, to just document the things that they're doing already, but to also ensure that those steps that they're taking in their processes are leading to compliance with the federal requirements and with prior approval.
Thank you, David. The fiscal unit has received a number of questions relative to prior approval, and you've responded to them, and I understand you have selected a number of them that you think may be helpful for the audience to hear the answer. It may be helpful to individuals to hear these answers. Let's review some of those questions.
How will grantees know when prior approval requests have been approved?
The grantee will receive an email from RSA fiscal unit staff that states prior approval has been granted and the date on which the request was approved. And again, we won't be doing this by telephone. They'll be receiving an email response. So it's important to ensure that A lot of people will copy or make sure that more than one person is listed on those, because sometimes if we respond and somebody's out on vacation or otherwise not available, so please make sure that you list the contact people in the email that you send to us with the request that we need to get back in touch with once the prior approval has been completed.
Will RSA provide a unique approval number when a prior approval authorization request is approved?
Not at this time. I know there are agencies who would have requested that we have a unique number so that for tracking purposes, but we simply don't have the ability to at this time.
Will RSA provide retroactive prior approval?
No, we're not able to do so. Grantee internal controls need to ensure prior approval is obtained in a timely manner prior to, again, the cost being incurred or the activity being undertaken for which prior approval is required.
If expenditures are approved for a specific grant award, can those costs be charged to the subsequent federal fiscal year's grant award?
As I mentioned earlier, prior approval is specific to a federal award. If a grantee wants to assign a cost approved for one award to a different grant award, the grantee would need to request prior approval to charge the cost to the new grant award number. In the event that grantee meets the criteria for the carryover of federal funds to a subsequent federal fiscal year, the prior approval would be valid for the carryover year of that federal award too, since the grant award number remains the same. Again, it's important that you submit the grant award number when any request for what you want to be charged. Please don't include more than one. We've had grantees that want to put like 2 or 3 fiscal years for which that cost might be incurred. But we need to know for our purposes what's going to be charged to each one of those awards as the request you're making. All right. Finally, if you have any additional questions that you have with regard to this presentation or with prior approval, please forward those to the rsafiscal@ed.gov email address, and we'll work to get your response as soon as we can. All right. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Julia. And we thank you, audience, for participating in this program, the first of a series of 5 technical assistance programs devoted to prior approval. And we invite you to review the following 4 programs. Thank you very much.